Chapter 1. The woman who built a slaughterhouse beneath her home. The first body did not surface in a river. It surfaced in a sewer where the city tried to forget what it flushed away. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on May 8, 2006, the western district of Linjiang suffocated under the weight of summer. The temperature reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air clung to skin and lungs alike. Beneath an overpass near the Third Ring Road, a sanitation crew began routine dredging of a wastewater channel feeding into the Pearl River. The smell was familiar at first. Rotting trash, industrial residue, stagnant water. The kind of odor men learned to ignore after years on the job. Then the flow slowed. The pump strained. Something large resisted being pulled free. 2 workers climbed down into the access shaft with flashlights. Their beams cut through black water and tangled debris. Plastic bags. Grease. Sludge. And then something pale pressed against the metal filter, swollen and soft, its surface torn by pressure. One of the men assumed it was spoiled pork. He reached out with a pole to dislodge it. The smell changed instantly. It was no longer waste. It was iron. Sweet. Heavy. A scent that triggered instinctive nausea rather than disgust. When the water level dropped further, a shape emerged. Fingers. Curled. White. Skin stripped away. The call to police came minutes later. Detective Chin Feng arrived to find the area sealed off and 6 black plastic bags laid out on the concrete. When they were opened, even experienced officers turned away. Inside were human remains, cut into segments and mixed deliberately with refuse. Arms separated from torsos. Flesh processed to obscure identity. This was not panic disposal. This was method. Forensic examination began immediately. The tissues showed prolonged exposure to chemicals, high-concentration chlorine compounds, an attempt not only to delay decomposition but to erase fingerprints and surface DNA. Whoever had done this understood what investigators looked for and how to make it disappear. In the debris, one object resisted the process. A cheap metal ring still hooked around the bone of a severed finger. It was crude, masculine, the kind sold in night markets. Inside its band, crude engravings remained visible under magnification. 2 intertwined letters. A year. It was the first mistake the killer made. By midnight, the forensic lab lights were still on. A pathologist reconstructed what could be reassembled. The victim was male. Early 20s. Strong musculature. The injuries told a story far worse than death alone. Circular burn marks. Shallow incisions designed not to kill, but to prolong pain. Evidence of sedation. The cause of death was a combination of hemorrhagic shock and respiratory suppression. This man had not been killed quickly. He had been kept. As the hours passed, another truth became impossible to ignore. The precision of the cuts, the chemical treatment, the location of disposal. None of it pointed to desperation. This was infrastructure. A system designed to consume and erase human beings without attracting attention. When missing persons reports were cross-checked, a pattern began to emerge. Young men, physically fit, migrant workers, disappearing quietly after speaking of sudden opportunity. Easy money. Powerful benefactors. They were not hunted in alleys. They were invited. By dawn, investigators understood they were not dealing with a single murder or even a single victim. They were staring at the output of something much larger. This was not a murder scene. It was a disposal system. Chapter 2. The bodies that did not belong to one man. By the second day, investigators stopped asking who the victim was and began asking how many there might be. The forensic laboratory became the center of gravity for the case. Stainless steel tables filled with labeled fragments. Photographs pinned in sequence. Measurements logged with clinical detachment. What emerged was not the reconstruction of a single man, but the outline of a process. The cuts were consistent, precise, clean. Joints separated at anatomically efficient points. There was no evidence of hesitation. Whoever handled the blade knew exactly where resistance would be weakest. This was not the work of an amateur reacting in panic. It was repetition refined by experience. Chemical analysis confirmed the same conclusion. Chlorine-based industrial cleaning agents had been used in controlled concentrations, strong enough to damage surface DNA and delay decomposition, weak enough to preserve muscle structure long enough for transport. This balance was not accidental. It suggested testing, adjustment, learning. The injuries that mattered most, however, were not the fatal ones. On reconstructed sections of skin, pathologists documented dozens of circular burns, each roughly half a centimeter in diameter. Cigarette burns, inflicted while the victim was alive. The tissue response was unmistakable. Inflammation, bruising, healing attempts that never reached completion. Along the thighs and torso, shallow incisions ran parallel, deliberate and non-lethal. Pain without purpose except endurance. This man had been kept alive for reasons unrelated to efficiency. Sedatives were present in the bloodstream, not enough to induce unconsciousness, enough to slow resistance, enough to maintain compliance. The cause of death was a calculated combination of blood loss and respiratory suppression, timed to occur only after prolonged trauma. As the findings accumulated, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not rage. It was control. The ring recovered from the sewer offered the first fragile anchor to identity. The engravings were crude, uneven, likely done by hand. Initials intertwined. A year that suggested birth or significance. When missing persons records were cross-referenced against the estimated age and physical profile, one name rose to the surface. Wang Jun. He was 24 years old. A freelance fitness trainer. Occasionally worked as nightclub security. Muscular. Well-built. The kind of physique that attracted attention in places where strength carried social currency. He had disappeared 2 weeks earlier after telling his mother he had met a wealthy woman who promised to change his life. She had offered him money, housing, opportunity. His mother recognized the ring instantly. She collapsed when she saw it. She said she had given it to him as a birthday gift. She said he had carved the letters himself to mark it as his own. He wore it every day. The call he made to her before disappearing had been optimistic. Excited. He spoke of a benefactor, a woman of influence, someone who admired his appearance and wanted to support his ambitions. He joked that his only responsibility was to make her happy. It was the last time she heard his voice. As officers expanded their search, Wang Jun stopped being an exception. He became a reference point. 12 other missing persons reports surfaced with unsettling similarities. Young men, migrant backgrounds, physically fit, financially unstable. All had spoken to family or friends about sudden opportunity shortly before vanishing. None had been reported missing immediately. Their disappearances were gradual, quiet, dismissed as poor communication or deliberate distance. In a city built on temporary lives, absence rarely triggered urgency. This delay worked in the killer's favor. Investigators began mapping the disappearances spatially. Patterns emerged. Nightclubs, informal gyms, labor markets, places where young men gathered to sell strength and presence, places where being noticed felt like possibility rather than danger. The implication was no longer subtle. These men had not been abducted. They had been recruited. Further examination of recovered remains revealed additional layers of intention. Some wounds showed variation in depth and placement, suggesting experimentation rather than escalation. Others showed signs of healing, indicating captivity measured not in hours, but in days or weeks. The victim had been observed over time. Evaluated, modified. This was not consumption in haste. It was selection followed by possession. As the scope widened, so did the pressure. Media inquiries increased. City officials demanded progress. The presence of chemical agents raised concerns about industrial access. The precision of the work raised questions about training. Every new detail expanded the list of what the killer could be. And what the killer was not. This was not a man acting alone in desperation. This was not a crime born of immediate need. The infrastructure required to sustain this pattern demanded resources. Space. Privacy. Protection from scrutiny. Someone had provided all three. Investigators now understood that the sewer was not where the crime happened. It was merely where the city encountered the evidence. The real location was somewhere far cleaner, far quieter, somewhere designed to prevent sound from escaping and attention from forming. A place where men could disappear without neighbors asking questions. And somewhere within that structure, someone was still choosing. They were not chosen by chance. They were selected. Chapter 3. The Market Where Men Were Sold. The investigation shifted direction once investigators accepted a conclusion that felt deeply uncomfortable. These men had not been taken by force. They had walked into the system willingly, guided by promises that exploited both desperation and hope. That realization led police away from crime scenes and toward markets. Not physical markets, but social ones. Places where bodies were valued. Where strength, youth, and appearance translated into opportunity. Nightclubs. Informal gyms. Employment brokers operating on the margins of legality. Spaces where background checks were rare and questions were unwelcome. Undercover officers embedded themselves quietly. They listened. They watched who was approached and by whom. It did not take long for a name to surface. He was known only as He Lao, a middleman with a reputation for discretion. He did not advertise openly. He did not recruit aggressively. He waited for men to come to him with complaints. Debt, unemployment, frustration. When they asked for fast money, he offered introductions. One-way trips. According to those who had dealt with him, the work was simple. Temporary labor, private clients, discretion required. Payment generous. Cash. No paperwork. No return calls. The men who accepted the offers were told their clients valued privacy and loyalty. If the arrangement went well, it could become permanent. None of the men ever came back. To test the pipeline, investigators inserted an undercover operative into He Lao's orbit. He was young, physically imposing, recently unemployed. He complained loudly about money and implied he would do anything to escape his situation. Within days, He Lao noticed him. The conversation was casual, almost friendly. He Lao explained the rules. No questions. No phones. Follow instructions. If the client approved, life would change overnight. The pickup would be late. The vehicle would arrive without warning. On the night arranged, a black van rolled into a narrow alley behind a street market. Its headlights were dimmed. Its windows opaque. The license plate was obscured deliberately. The driver did not introduce himself. He spoke little. He gestured for the recruit to enter. Surveillance teams followed at a distance. The van did not take a direct route. It looped through dense residential blocks, changed speed unpredictably, turned repeatedly to test for pursuit. The driver understood counter-surveillance. This was not his first delivery. After nearly an hour, the van accelerated toward the outskirts of the city. Fog rolled in from the hills. Visibility dropped. Communication with the trailing units weakened. At a fork in the road, the van made a sudden turn and extinguished its lights completely. By the time the police adjusted, it was gone. The road led to two destinations. One toward uninhabited hills. The other toward a private residential complex known for its exclusivity. Gated. Guarded. Home to executives and senior officials. Entry without authorization was impossible. The trail ended there. 3 days later, another body surfaced. This one was not fragmented completely. A torso was discovered at a municipal dump on the southern edge of the city. The head and limbs were missing. The cuts were cleaner than before, more efficient. The killer was refining technique. Autopsy revealed a detail that changed the case. The victim's stomach contents included undigested beef and traces of an expensive French red wine. Chemical analysis identified it as a Grand Cru vintage. Rare. Costly. Not something a migrant laborer could afford. Not something served casually. This had been a final meal. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A man taken from the margins of society, fed like a guest of honor, then killed with clinical precision. The symbolism was not subtle. It suggested power, control, a deliberate inversion of status. Investigators returned to the residential complex. Records showed a limited number of residents. Among them, a pattern emerged. Wealth, privacy, and among a small subset, a particular purchasing history. One name stood out. Zhao Lihua. She was 54 years old. Widowed. A real estate magnate. Known publicly for philanthropy and cultural patronage. She lived alone in a secluded villa at the far end of the complex. Her donations funded hospitals. Her face appeared regularly in newspapers beside smiling children. She also maintained a private wine collection that included multiple Grand Cru vintages. When investigators visited her under the pretext of a routine security inquiry, she was calm, polite, impeccably composed. She answered questions without hesitation, offered tea, spoke warmly about safety concerns and community responsibility. But one detail disrupted the illusion. Her gaze lingered on the undercover operative accompanying the detectives. It was not curiosity. It was assessment. A slow, deliberate evaluation that measured muscle and posture with practiced familiarity. The kind of look reserved for objects, not people. When they left, the investigators exchanged no words. They did not need to. The system they were chasing no longer felt abstract. It had an address. It had resources. And it had a host who understood exactly what she was offering. They just did not yet understand how many men had already accepted the invitation. The killer did not hide in the slums. She lived behind gates. The Chapter 4, The House That Ate People. Detective Chin Feng understood a hard rule of investigations involving wealth. Evidence did not simply need to exist. It needed to be strong enough to survive lawyers, influence, and the kind of informal protection that never appeared in official records. A gated residence did not merely keep strangers out. It kept consequences away. After the visit to Zhao Lihua's villa, surveillance began quietly. Her driver was identified within hours. He was called a Xiong. His true name, according to internal records, was Chen Jihong, 45 years old. Prior convictions for violent assault and unlawful detention. 15 years served. The kind of history that should have disqualified him from private security work for anyone with public standing. And yet he lived on the property. The arrangement raised an immediate question. Why would a prominent businesswoman obsessed with reputation accept the risk of keeping a convicted violent offender so close? The answer was not obvious. That was what made it valuable. Teams watched a Xiong's routine. He was quiet, methodical. He kept to himself. The van associated with prior surveillance was stored in a separate garage structure. The garage door remained shut for long periods. At night, faint mechanical sounds leaked through the walls. Tools! Engines. Something operating out of sight. On one occasion, officers observed him driving the black van to a remote automated car wash in the early hours of the morning. He cleaned not only the exterior, but the interior with obsessive care. Brushes. Foam. A chemical agent applied to the cargo area and scrubbed until the surfaces shone. Investigators sampled runoff from the drainage channel after he left. Preliminary testing suggested the presence of blood residues diluted into the waste stream. Not enough for identification. Enough for confirmation. Still, confirmation was not a warrant. A second attempt to access the property was staged as a municipal inspection, a coordinated visit with fire safety personnel and administrative staff. The objective was simple: observe the grounds. Identify anything unusual. Look for concealed structures. Signs of excavation. Unnatural odor control. At first glance, the villa and its garden seemed impeccable. Landscaping trimmed to perfection. Paved paths clean of debris. Decorative plants heavy with fragrance. Too heavy. To Qin Feng, the floral intensity felt less like taste and more like strategy. Strong perfume did not eliminate unpleasant odor. It competed with it, attempting to overwhelm the senses. In homicide work, masking was often as revealing as concealment. A search dog brought by the inspection team changed the atmosphere instantly. It became unsettled near the northwest corner of the garden, circling a massive ceramic planter set on a section of concrete that looked newer than the surrounding paving. The dog did not bark. It whined low, tail tucked, scratching the ground as if warning rather than announcing. Qin Feng stepped closer. Before he could examine the area, Zhao Lihua appeared. Her composure was still intact, but her voice sharpened. She demanded an explanation for the dog. She claimed property damage. She threatened lawsuits. She threatened careers. A Xiong moved into position like a shield, gripping a gardening tool in a way that signaled readiness. Without a warrant, the inspection team withdrew. What remained behind was not defeat. It was certainty. Zhao Lihua had reacted like someone protecting more than flowers. The break came from a place no one could control. The third psychiatric hospital on the outskirts admitted an unidentified young man found wandering in a forested zone, dehydrated and injured, speaking incoherently. Local police initially assumed drug intoxication or acute psychosis. Fingerprinting proved otherwise. He was one of the missing, 22 years old. Reported absent for 3 months. His name was not released publicly at first, but within the task force, it carried immediate weight. A missing man had returned alive, and he had returned broken. Qin Feng and the forensic pathologist visited the hospital under strict security. The patient was restrained for his own protection. His eyes remained wide, fixed on the ceiling as if he expected it to open. When staff approached with instruments, he screamed. When he smelled disinfectant, his breathing accelerated into panic. It took hours to gain a coherent statement. When he spoke, he did not begin with a name. He began with a color. White. A room without windows. A bed made of metal. Chains fixed to the wall. A woman who entered as if she owned the air itself. Sometimes dressed in silk. Sometimes dressed in a doctor's coat. She did not strike with impulse. She inflicted pain slowly, measuring reaction, correcting technique, as if the body beneath her was a problem to solve. He described shallow cuts to the thigh. Cigarette burns placed carefully, as if spacing mattered. A voice close to his ear, not angry, but affectionate. Words that turned suffering into intimacy. He described other voices in the distance, muffled by walls. He described crying that stopped abruptly. He described the mechanical whine of a saw, running long enough to suggest routine. Then he described the transport. A sack, a van, a driver who assumed the body inside was finished. A stop on a mountain road, a moment of negligence. The patient said he tore the sack with his teeth and rolled out, falling into brush that broke his descent. He crawled for days. He did not know how far. He only knew he had to keep moving. The medical examination confirmed what his mind could barely hold. Scars, burns, incisions matching those documented on the recovered remains. Evidence that linked captivity to the deaths already confirmed. This was the missing piece that influence could not erase. A witness, a living record, a body that carried the crime on its skin. That night, a meeting was called. The task force presented the evidence. The prior surveillance, the chemical residues, the dog's reaction, the witness statement supported by physical examination, the pattern of disappearances, the wine, the van, the gates. The only obstacle left was permission. Senior officials hesitated. They worried about reputation, about legal retaliation, about political fallout if the search produced nothing. Lain Feng made a choice that ended caution. He told them time was the enemy. After the inspection attempt, Zhao Lihua would be alert. Evidence could be destroyed. Captives could be killed. A system could be sealed and buried. Finally, a warrant was signed. The raid was scheduled for the hour when human vigilance collapses. In the early morning, a storm rolled over Linjiang, thunder covering the approach of police vehicles. The complex gates were breached. A Sheng was restrained before he could reach a weapon. Zhao Lihua sat calmly in a chair, dressed as if she had been waiting, speaking with the confidence of someone who expected the law to blink first. The search began immediately. Floors, walls, garden structures. Nothing. Minutes stretched. Tension rose. The risk of failure sharpened into dread. Then the pathologist's attention fixed on the wine cabinet, an elaborate structure occupying an entire wall. The floor in front of it showed faint marks, curved scratches that suggested weight moved repeatedly across polished wood. She pressed close, felt a draft where no draft should exist, and caught the faint, unmistakable bite of disinfectant. Behind the cabinet, something breathed cold air into the room. Qin Feng found one bottle that would not lift from its rack. He turned it. A mechanical click answered. The cabinet split and slid aside, revealing a reinforced steel door built into the wall. For the first time that night, Zhao Lihua's face changed. The teacup on the table trembled slightly. Her confidence did not vanish, but it cracked. The door opened. Air spilled out. It was not simply cold. It was sterile. Chemical. Thick with a smell that no amount of perfume could erase. The task force stepped into the darkness, lights raised, and the house finally revealed what it had been eating. This was not obsession. This was ownership. Emma Chapter 5. What Power Leaves Behind. The underground room did not resemble a place of chaos. It resembled a facility. Metal beds were bolted to the floor. Restraints were cleaned and organized. Surgical tools were arranged with obsessive care. Shelving units held labeled containers filled with clear liquid, inside which human remains floated in suspension. The temperature was controlled. The air circulation was deliberate. Nothing here suggested impulse. Everything suggested maintenance. Zhao Lihua watched the search without protest. She did not scream. She did not deny. She did not attempt escape. When asked why, she answered calmly that everything had been done with consent, that the men had accepted her terms, that she had given them food, shelter, money, that what followed was simply the natural extension of ownership. Her statement did not shock the investigators. It confirmed what the evidence had already implied. Power had not driven her to madness. It had insulated her from consequence long enough for desire to become policy. The trial that followed was closed to the public, not for lack of interest, but for fear of it. The testimony of the surviving victim was delivered behind a screen. His voice shook, but his scars did not. They were displayed clinically, documented in photographs and medical reports that silenced the room more effectively than any words. Ashong was convicted quickly. His role was clear. Transport, restraint, disposal. He did not attempt justification. He said he had followed orders because obedience was easier than poverty. Zhao Lihua maintained composure to the end. She spoke of loneliness, of aging, of being admired only for wealth. She framed her actions as transactions, stripping them of moral weight by drowning them in language of exchange. The court rejected her narrative. She was sentenced to death. Official records listed 13 confirmed victims. Investigators believed the true number was higher. Containers had been emptied. Chemicals replaced. Logs destroyed. Some men had been consumed so completely that no trace remained for identification. Their families received no bodies. Only notifications. only absence formalized by paperwork. In the weeks that followed, the villa was sealed. The wine cabinet removed. The underground structure dismantled and filled with concrete. Officials described the measures as necessary for safety. No one described them as sufficient. The neighborhood returned to normal. Guards resumed their routines. New residents moved in. Conversations avoided specifics. Wealth learned, as it always does, how to look away from its own reflection. But the case left a residue that could not be disinfected. It challenged a comforting myth that brutality belongs to desperation, that monsters announce themselves, that money civilizes desire. This case demonstrated something colder, that given enough protection, cruelty does not need to hide. It only needs to organize. It becomes quiet, efficient, invisible. It feeds without urgency and discards without remorse. We search for killers in shadows and alleyways. We imagine danger wearing poverty and rage. But sometimes the most efficient predators live behind gates, drink rare wine, and speak softly about generosity. And when the system that enables them finally cracks, what remains is not mystery. It is inventory. Some killers use knives. Others use money. And money cuts deeper than any blade.